Hi. Today we're going to talk about attitudes in the workplace as affective, behavioral, and cognitive. We don't look at it in that order, but it's a good way to remember those components of attitudes. And the workplace effects of attitudes, the ones there in yellow are really the ones that take place within the employee, and then the ones in white that are italicized are actual behaviors that, things that you can actually see that show up in the workplace. Personal attitudes, we talk about them because they do have to do with behavior, as I said, or as you would understand, they're more permanent than emotions or moods, even though they're often related to them. They're important because they do impact behavior, and in a work setting, they're related to a lot of important indicators of high performance, or in a negative sense, to things like withdrawal. Indicators of withdrawal, we call them things like lateness, absenteeism, turnover, and we'll talk later about something called counterproductive work behaviors, which are even more extreme than those examples. We'll start with a quick question. I know that students like to practice with these questions. So let's take a look at a question here. Roger is inclined to dislike salesmen. This predisposition may be defined as... And let's see what you come up with for this one. Wasn't that hard. You probably already knew because you knew the meanings of those other terms anyway. So, some of the stuff we're going to talk about today really has to do with, or in this little mini lesson, has to do with stuff. We'll repeat stuff that you used in your Psych 101 class. What is an attitude? Again, this is exactly the definition, or pretty much the definition that I gave you before. It generally has to do with behavioral intentions, how you want to behave, and generally what you'll say about the object of the attitude. We'll consider certain work attitudes, things like organizational commitment. We'll talk about job satisfaction, job involvement. It plays a really key role in employee turnover. And if you think of, for example, people have attitudes about Macintosh computers or about PCs, and those carry through in buyer behavior and just in general approach to things, or the day-to-day approach to things. If you perceive positive attitudes, very often you'll develop a positive attitude. So that's really where they often comes from. We'll talk about other sources of attitudes as well in a moment. And we'll talk about cognitive dissonance and cognitive consistency. The attitude-behavior relationship is very strong when attitudes are very specific. Another key aspect of an attitude, if you're inclined a certain way toward a political party, then that will play out in behavior. Inclined a certain way, having an attitude about product lines or suppliers, that plays out as well in your behavior in the organization. Where do these things come from? They come from your experience. They create a tendency or an intention to behave a certain way. Those experiences include your basic values. They include things you hear from teachers, from parents, friends, in general, from the culture in general. Let's take a quick look now. You said that ABC, that there's the affective, behavioral, and cognitive components. So let's take a look at this question here. The blank component of an attitude reflects a person's underlying belief about something. Belief is a key word here. Okay, and let's see what you came up with. The answer is cognitive, the cognitive component, because it's based on information, it's based on that type of experience, based on knowledge, or again, we'll call it information because knowledge, you may say, well, if it's knowledge, it has to be true. Well, information, sometimes you get bad information, so we'll use either of those terms in this instance interchangeably, though we'll talk about at other times about using them, distinguishing between them. So again, you've got the cognitive component, the affective component, and the behavioral component. And attitudes, values are really, to contrast this with values which you've already sort of looked at a little bit more, they represent the values are more global beliefs, whereas as attitudes are specific objects or persons or situations. We can look at that, an example from the workplace here. What is an attitude? How does it influence behavior? The cognition, and again, I'll mention right now and again in a moment that we sort of strive to keep an equilibrium, or to keep a consistency, cognitive consistency among our different attitudes. So, for example, you're not going to say, I don't like salespeople, but I like people that sell cars or jewelry or computers. I purposely picked the most hardcore type of hard sell type of salespeople. You wouldn't see that. That would create a dissonance, and we'll talk about that in a while as well. So these work-related attitudes. Here's an example of cognition is that my job I don't have enough responsibility. It's not important. The example that creates an affect, a feeling that I just don't like it. And then, of course, the intended behavior. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to quit your job, but it does mean that you are more inclined to quit your job than you would if you didn't have that same cognition, if you weren't experiencing that. Now let's consider cognitive dissonance. Again, that inconsistency between two attitudes, or between an attitude and your actual behavior. How you deal with it, we'll talk about in a second. I'll give you an example. A work-related example would be, let's say that you're a very environmentally conscious person. You're working for a company that makes that consideration very low among the factors that it uses when it makes investment or oil exploration decisions, or whatever it is that you're responsible for. So how do you respond to that? One way to respond to it is, of course, to leave your job and to do something else. But let's think in terms of changing the underlying attitude. You can really adapt your attitude. I imagine if you're making enough money or whatever, you could actually change your attitude in that regard. You can change your future behavior too. It's possible that you can do things that are not exactly consistent with what with the letter of the policy of your organization, and then of course you can develop new ways to explain it and rationalize it. And one way to rationalize it would be to say, I'm doing this, and I know it's not good for the environment, but because I can do this, I'm making an extra $30,000 a year, and I'm giving $10,000 of that to the environment. So it's even better than environmentally neutral. I'm still helping the environment, even though it's through this sort of roundabout way, or this rationalized way. Now, some of the ways that you as a manager can affect other people's job behavior is obviously enough, by improving other people's job satisfaction. The way to do that, it's really considered a mark of effective management to be able to get people to be, as a manager, to create a work environment where people achieve high performance, and achieving high performance is often an outcome of high job satisfaction. This is a very important concept in the whole field of organizational behavior. Someone with a high job involvement also identifies with his or her job, and would be expected, would work beyond expectations for a specific project. And you certainly see that in many of the most successful companies, is that the employees are that involved in their job, have that level of high involvement. Now let's take a quick review question now. If someone asks you how you feel about drivers who speed, he's asking you about the blank component of your attitude about those individuals. Okay, so how do you feel? All right, I think you'll probably know that answer. Affective. And when you think of the word feel, that really is kind of the instant answer for that. A cognitive component of that attitude would be these people are speeding. They're more likely to cause accidents. They're more likely to kill people. Maybe you've even seen the result of somebody using excessive speed and creating a very serious consequence in somebody else's life. And then, of course, the behavioral inclination. How can you actually slow somebody down? You can call the cops if somebody's really going crazy, or if you're somebody's trying to get to pass you, and you know that you're already doing 75 and a 55 or 65 and a 55, and you say, you know what? I'll move over when I feel like it. So that's a behavioral thing, which of course could lead to other consequences, road rage and stuff. I'm I'm not recommending it here. If we look at these key workplace attitudes, we think in terms of organizational commitment. Organizational commitment is really something that you always try to foster as a manager. And again, it's the extent to which you identify with an organization. You really want to improve. Among the things you want to improve in an organization when you're a manager: organizational commitment, employee engagement, which we'll talk about, perceived organizational support, which is associated with that, with those others, and job satisfaction. We'll be talking about all of those. They do serve a really, two purposes. They're outcomes for managers that you can work to enhance directly, and they lead to other outcomes that are positive and performance measured, and you'll want to improve them too, and we'll mention that as well. Improved organizational commitment leads to this obviously, these two aspects. And continued employment, you really, until you've managed a group of people, you don't really realize the tremendous advantage that you have if you can create a high retention rate. Sometimes bringing in a new employee can actually cost you as much or more than having an employee keeping an employee for a whole year. I mean, the cost of getting somebody ramped up and especially in a very complex kind of a work environment, a complex kind of a role, can just be prohibitive. I mean, you really want to hold on to the good people you have, and ways to increase employee commitment. The first thing is to pick the right people. And that's we've seen. I think we've talked a little bit about. Southwest talks about that as the most important thing that they do. Other companies as well, which we'll mention in a subsequent class, they feel that that's the most important thing. If you can pick the right people. And actually, there are lots of very successful business books talking specifically about that. If you got the right people, the mission will almost emerge because the right people will be working on creating a mission, on creating a strategy, and you'll see that better things will happen. Maybe not going all the way back to the mission of the company, but certainly some of the real basic behaviors of the company and things that you have to do. So you want to make sure that you hire people that share the values. Their values are aligned with yours, with the company's values. You want to make sure management does not breach the psychological contract. Now, we talked for a moment about psychological contract before, but what you want to understand about the psychological contract is it's implied. It's not any kind of a written contract, and it's what people expect from the company, and what people expect to be the relationship between them and the company, what they have to give and what they get back, and if that is ever breached, which it is at times by various companies, perhaps every company at one time or another, that employee breach is always associated with lower organizational commitment, lower job satisfaction, decreased or hindered performance, and greater intentions to quit. So that's something that, by honoring those psychological contracts, by choosing the right people, you can increase commitment and improve trust. And that, I can't overstate that the value of that. Another one of those attitudes is employee engagement, and get people to put everything they have into their roles, and you do that. Really, the four feelings that you want to associate with that are urgency, increased focus or being focused, intensity, and enthusiasm. Identify those as the four feelings that tend to be associated with employee engagement. And I would say intensity and focus are the ones that come to my mind immediately. Urgency and enthusiasm, you almost, enthusiasm, I think, part of that is you really have to select on that. But these other things are things that you really can inculcate or at least reinforce in your employees. The way we look at employee engagement is three factors that contribute to it. Okay, three sets of factors. Organizational level of factors. What do you do to get and to keep people engaged? Career opportunities. Quality performance of the management itself, improved organizational reputation. If the people tend to be more engaged, if they feel that they're recognized for it and that the company is recognized for it, superior or quality communication, good reliable communication, and recognition. Individual recognition is something that really means a lot to a lot of employees. Those are the organizational level factors. Person factors include you want to hire people who are positive and optimistic generally, because those are the people that tend to become more engaged. Now, there are some industries where optimism isn't absolutely necessary for success, but generally speaking, it's something that you look for. You want proactive personalities, people that get out and challenge and do things without having to be pushed or having to be urged to do them, and conscientiousness, which is as we will talk about again and again, is a key aspect of successful employees, high performing employees in every industry. Environmental characteristics. This is within the sort of the micro environment a little bit, rather than at the organizational level, but at the individuals. Within the individual's immediate environment. The job characteristics, we'll talk later about the job characteristics model. There are aspects of the job or characteristics of the job, things like autonomy, which is being independent and able to make decisions. Task significance, which is doing something that actually benefits somebody or somebody's inside or outside the organization. We'll talk about those job characteristics later, but those have a really important connection to employee engagement. Leadership, because when you've got a manager that's trusting and maintains a good relationship with the employees, that improves that type of engagement. And stressors, you have to maintain the appropriate level of stress, which usually means not too high, but sometimes it'll mean not too low. But when you stress people too much, they break down and their the level of engagement suffers. How do you, as a manager, track and measure employee engagement? The book talks about employee surveys. I think there are other means of feedback also, and quality communication, listening, and sometimes the work environment itself. Those all can. I'm talking about the actual physical layout of the place can also improve employee engagement and enhance employee engagement. Received organizational support. This is one of the aspects of when we talked about organizational support. This is the extent to which the organization really believes, the extent to which you think the organization cares about you. And again, it's really hard to have something as impersonal or as large as an organization to actually have this kind of a personality, personification. But you can create policies that will support that. Because if you work for a company where you have a bad boss, and I've always said this, and I've seen this with actually in my own family where people have people that I know have left jobs that really had a lot of promise for them. Fortunately for them, they went on to good things, but they left jobs that held a lot of promise for them because of the manager. And I've always sort of said half laughingly, you don't quit a company, you quit a manager. You don't quit a job, you quit a manager. But it's so often the case. And again, I can say in the case of my own family members who I'm very close to, two really specific cases, which I probably mentioned once or twice in class, where it just was impossible because the manager was just not competent. If you're not getting good health care benefits, things like that can make a really big difference too. And if you, this is sort of the mechanism through which it works. If you perceive that the organization is supportive of you, the people you're going to be willing to work hard, you're going to commit, and all those indicators of performance will improve or may improve. Here's another question that I know these questions are probably a little too easy, but students say they want me to continue keeping them in the video, so I will. Sandra manages the marketing department for the Greener Grass Corporation. In an effort to increase employee engagement, Sandra should try all the following except, and you'll see a key word here that will show you that the answer is clearly D, because you don't want to hire people who are high on pessimism, generally speaking. And I purposely didn't make it, if I had made this like the Central Intelligence Agency, there are some places where you don't really want people necessarily to be that optimistic. You want people to really be looking for the worst possible side of things. So, so I growing grass, be optimistic, okay? What is job satisfaction? We've talked about it. You probably know what it is intuitively anyway. What you want to understand is it's not a single identifiable sort of unitary concept. A person can be relatively satisfied with one aspect of the job and relatively dissatisfied with another aspect of the job. On balance, there will be some kind of almost a quotient or a summative job satisfaction response. But generally speaking, you'll find that it's a hard thing sometimes to. In your own job, you might have thought of that too, and in anybody else there'll always be something that you don't like about the job, and when that sort of becomes ascendant in the way you maybe have a busy season, and during the busy season you have to do things you don't like, or maybe there are certain cycles, and when you have to deal with a certain category of customers, you don't like that part of the job. But again, formally defined, it's an affective or emotional response to the different facets of your job. So that's something you want to know. We're going to talk a little bit now about general models of job satisfaction, and you don't have to know a lot about most of them. I'll let you know when we're getting. So first of all, the obvious one. Need fulfillment. Need fulfillment is a pretty easy model to conceptualize. Okay, it's determined by the how well the job allows you to fulfill your needs. It certainly includes things like money. In a technical sense, sort of a Psych 101 definition, needs. We want to talk about the word needs. They're physiological, psychological deficiencies that arouse behavior. You want something, you don't have it, you behave a certain way, that increases the likelihood of you getting it. All these different needs, they vary so much, but generally speaking, need fulfillment is correlated with job satisfaction. So, if it helps you fulfill your needs, then it counts. Okay. Met expectations. Are you getting what you expected to get? This ties into the psychological contract. Good pay, promotional opportunities, and are the things that you expected, whether they promised them or not, the things that you expected really being delivered. When expectations are greater than what you're actually receiving, then you're going to be dissatisfied. Value attainment, we're not going to spend a lot of time on this. It's the satisfaction, the idea that satisfaction results from the perception that the job allows you to fulfill your important values. So again, if you're hiring people whose values are aligned with yours, or if you're working for a company whose values are aligned with yours, then you're going to have a high enough level of value attainment. Equity, yes, it's in uppercase. Okay, equity is something we are going to talk about for a moment, and it's something we're going to talk about again and again because it plays so much into things like organizational justice and in addition to job satisfaction and retention, lots of other aspects of success in the workplace. It results from the perception that the work outcomes that you have that are relative to your inputs compare favorably to somebody else's. Now we're going to look at this. For example, I don't have to tell you, I'm a professor here. Do I experience inequity when I see another professor teaching the same number of students with the same qualifications that I have and apparently the same amount of effort, and I see that person getting a lot more money than I get? That would lead to some negative equity. It isn't the fact that I'm basically looking at what I put into it against what I get out of it, but it's what I put into it compared to what somebody else puts into it. Somebody else's ratio of outcomes to inputs. And I'll give you, we have an example that we'll look at in a couple of minutes, but let's take a look at another question here. Again, an easy review of what we just did. David, an accountant with Brighter Future Corporation. Corporation is experiencing job dissatisfaction due to comparing how hard he works and how much he gets paid versus his perception of a coworker's effort and reward. And we'll look into this a little bit more detail in a second. David's dissatisfaction can be explained by, which one of those terms? Yes, I know, I just gave you the answer, because he's comparing the outputs to to he's looking at what somebody else is getting and he's comparing it to what he's getting. Now we'll take a look at a little graphic of what we're talking about here. So if you look at the first one there, outcomes to inputs means that I'm putting in a certain amount of effort, $25 worth of inputs, we'll call it per hour, and I'm getting back $50 worth of value. Or even if it's lower, even if the fact is, I don't think this is really a great job. However, inequity isn't the reason, because even though we're both getting $40 of outcome out of $80 of inputs being things like qualifications, educational experience, effort, and performance. Obviously, those are the inputs that we're putting in, and the outcomes are the things that we're getting out, which will qualify as salary at this point. But obviously, it includes things like benefits and anything else that you can monetize like that, or that you can quantify like that. So, for example, and now if you look just below that, positive equity, just below that scale, is where I'm getting essentially a better deal. I'm getting a better ratio than the other person. My outcomes, let's say that it's $50 worth of outcome, meaning salary primarily, but also benefits, possibly some other aspect, that is some other thing that I'm realizing. As compared to my inputs are my work experience, my educational background, my effort, and actually my performance, my overall performance are all inputs. The outcome is better than the input by quite a bit, so it is a very strong positive equity there. And the other person is the person I'm comparing it to may have the identical inputs that I have, but their outputs are much less, so that mine is weighting heavier. How do you feel when you experience positive inequity if you're getting a better deal than somebody else? How do you respond to that? We'll talk about that later on, actually. We'll talk about this actual graphic again later on also. The negative inequity is I'm getting less than the other person. Look at me. I'm the light one there, but the other person, that outcomes to inputs, they're getting more compared to what they're putting in than I am. Now, just because somebody's getting more doesn't mean you're going to be experiencing negative inequity. The president of this university makes several times what I make, and I know I've known some of the previous presidents fairly well. This one seems very competent too. But the ones I've known really well, I've talked to them about their jobs. When like a student dies, they have to go to the funeral. Comfort the parents. It is a very, very stressful and compelling job, and the hours never stop. So but if one of my colleagues who teaches courses like I do has the same same qualifications, same general outcomes, the same general performance, then I would see, then I would experience that negative inequity. And then how we respond to negative inequity, we'll be talking about different ways that people respond. We'll talk about that later on. And the last model of job satisfaction, again, equity is really the one that we're focused on the most, is disposition, genetic, sort of personal traits and genetic factors. It is said within the industry, within the HR and the human resources industry, and management in general, in the field of organizational behavior, that up to 30% or about 30% of a person's individual job satisfaction is associated with these disposition, meaning sort of your personality or your genetic components. Now, this is an interesting thing. So it means if you want to have satisfied employees, then you hire satisfied workers. That is a 30% true. All right, at least to some of the 30% of that difference is accounted for by dispositional or personality and genetic components. Now here's move ahead for a second. What do we call the extra things that people do for others when in the conduct of their jobs? what do you call this? You know what your job duties are. You know what a lot of the, sort of the other things that you bring into a job. What do we call those things? Those extra things, and what they're called is OCBs, and you should need to know them as organizational citizenship behaviors, or OCBs. We'll talk about some examples of them in a second, but that was kind of a preview question. So let's talk about these organizational citizenship behaviors. We've got a definition here, a willingness to go beyond the call of duty, to go the extra mile. An example of this, maybe you've seen, a teacher when they're walking out of the classroom, there's just some bottles or some wrappers on the floor, and they'll pick them up and throw them out. Okay, that is an organizational citizenship behavior, and I guess on the part of the students it is too. Although I don't see it that often among anybody, but certainly you should pick up a bottle because somebody could fall over it. But I mean, but generally speaking, I don't run around picking up everything because I'm in the class early. I do try to make it look a little better because everybody coming in knows that my class. You and I are the reason that it's that the mess is there. A willingness to do those extra things, maybe take on extra tasks when a coworker is absent. That's sort of the interpersonal organizational citizenship behavior. A broader organizational citizenship behavior would be, for example, volunteering to be on a special committee, volunteering to go on a task force, to always say positive things when you're outside the organization talking about your company, and then there's another term, CWBs. Counterproductive work behaviors. You need to know that as CWBs also, and those are the things that are that purposely sort of disrupt relationships and culture and performance in the workplace. And we'll talk a little bit about them a little in a moment also. So OCBs again have a positive effect on the individual, positive effect on the organization. I'm not going to read you the slide. But it's certainly something that that you should recognize. Now we're just going to look at job satisfaction as sort of in the context of the things that it affects. Okay, it's a consequence of these are consequences of job satisfaction, and also correlate. A correlate means it sort of happens along with it, but an indicator of it, and sometimes a sort of an antecedent of it. But generally speaking, something that happens along with it, or as a result of it. Employee motivation, I don't have to tell you, obviously that it positively correlates to job satisfaction, needless to say. Job involvement, we've talked about also, that's the same thing. Withdrawal cognitions is a term that it doesn't just mean leaving the job. What it means is sort of checking out mentally. And your overall thoughts about the company are associated with that as well. So and stress, we've talked about having negative effects on lots of outcomes, work outcomes. It's positively related to absenteeism, turnover, meaning that it increases absenteeism or tends to increase absenteeism, turnover. Certain diseases, things like viral infections, colds and things, tends to be people under high stress tend to get more. Of course, they probably sleep less too, but tend to get more colds, tend to get more heart problems. So stress is really something that again is something that you really want to that high job satisfaction can help reduce. And one of the big controversies within organizational research is the relationship between job satisfaction and job performance, because it is very possible to have high job satisfaction without performing especially well. Even though you look at it and you say, well, there's all these different ways that things can be related. But we'll talk about this more in the future. But the two key findings you want to have here is that they are moderately related, that having high job satisfaction tends to be related to high job or superior job performance, but it is complex, and we do see sometimes that increasing job satisfaction does not necessarily always improve things like customer satisfaction and job performance in general. So that's something that you certainly want to know. It does have a very strong, moderately strong negative relationship to turnover. People with high job satisfaction, needless to say, are less likely overall to turn over, to leave. So enhancing job satisfaction tends to improve some of these. The way to improve, to reduce turnover is generally to hire people that fit within the organization. To provide effective onboarding, we talked a little bit about onboarding. We'll talk about it a lot when we talk about culture. Onboarding is the larger process of getting people to integrate and assimilate within the organization, getting them familiar with corporate policies, getting them to understand all the procedures that you use, and sort of familiarizing them with the politics of the organization as well. And to recognize and reward high performance, because high performers are much more likely to leave an organization if they're not compensated or recognized appropriately. So these are the aspects that I want you to remember about attitudes in the workplace. The ABC of attitudes: affective, behavioral, and cognitive. Understand what they are. Those general terms: cognitive dissonance, job satisfaction, organizational commitment, and of course job involvement as well. So understand how these things relate to attitudes in general and to specific attitudes, and what the effect is on these kinds of employee engagement, organizational citizenship behaviors, and also counterproductive work behaviors. So just in case, don't just look at the slides, because counterproductive work behaviors, CWBs, is also a concept that you'll want to know to be successful in this section of the course. Thank you.